look at Donald Trump and his longevity, his endurance, is that in a two-party system, right, it's the job of the party that he's not part of to do away with this extremist movement. And it's not done away with, right? We're coming up on the 10-year anniversary, and we're rushing into another election cycle where everything is on the ballot again. Everything. And it's a fraught time with all of that.
Well, and he, based on his CNN town hall, he will be running on guns. He mistakenly said there's 700 million guns in this country, and that the genie was out of the bottle and there was no way to fix it. And I think he said something really strange, like it's important to have these guns for entertainment purposes.
Yeah.
This is someone who was not in support of guns, before he ran for president, but he has tapped into that gun extremist. I mean, that it is his hardcore right-wing base. And guns, as I said earlier, that's an organizing principle now on the right wing.
And I think it's like the liability laws on all of these have to be targeted as well. It's clearly
Yes.
it's clearly the soft underbelly of it all. In your perfect world, you go back and you look at Aaron Sorkin's scripts. If I was advising someone in an election cycle, I'd say go watch some West Wing episodes and use some of the President Bartlett speeches. What would you like a president to get up in front of the country and say fearlessly about guns, about this moment? What would satisfy you?
Well, the first thing I want to say is that the Biden-Harris administration has been better on this issue than any administration in history. I do think President Biden has been pretty fearless in wrapping his arms around the gun safety movement, understanding they helped elect him to office, has not been afraid to talk about an assault weapons ban.
No
Has
disagreement.
done,
No disagreement on any of those
yeah,
things. But still, right? We
yeah.
have there is a speech, an address that needs to be given, in my view, that has not yet been given.
Mm.
If the perpetrators of the 200 mass shootings, right, were all from the Middle East, right, we
Right.
would be at war. And yet there is this numbness. We went to, I think one of the most extraordinary aspects of all of it is we went to war for 20 years after an attack that killed 3,000 Americans.
Mm.
How many Americans will be killed this year by guns? How many will be killed by mass shootings? And there is, broadly speaking, in the population, a lassitude, a helplessness about the issue. And I don't think that's how you see the issue. You've made tremendous progress, but what needs to be said that hasn't been said about this? In a
I
prayer,
think we talk.
you had the 8 o'clock hour for everybody
I
in.
think we. I think we talk a lot about the data and a lot about the science, but I don't think we talk enough about the emotion. This is a moral issue. Senator Chris Murphy, after the Buffalo and the Uvalde shootings, went on the floor and said, "What are we doing here? What are we doing?" In other words, who are we that we have come to a point in this country where children and people of color are slaughtered in places where we should feel safest, where Americans on a daily basis don't feel safe because we've allowed gun lobbyists to write our gun laws. Who are we? What are we doing here? And I think we have to appeal to the silent majority's sense of moral clarity. This is a reckoning. At some point, we are either going forward with gun extremism, guns for anyone, anywhere, anytime, no questions asked, and we have to understand that we have made an agreement as Americans that we will let children be killed in their schools. We will let children be killed in playgrounds and in their streets and in their communities. That is an acceptable sacrifice for the Second Amendment. Or we are going to go in a different direction. We're going to move away from that extremism, and we are going to decide that second graders are more important than the Second Amendment, and that we are better than this as a nation. We are more moral than this, and that we have been wrong, right? We have to admit, I think, at some point, that we have perverted, we've allowed the Second Amendment to be perverted.
Well, it's not just perverted. I mean, it's the Second Amendment has a wholly different meaning today that's been politicized, propagandized. That's a total departure from what it was thought to be, meant to be, how it was treated by the overwhelming, majority of Americans, right? Not 100 years ago, right? 20 years ago, not so long ago, whatsoever. I wanted to ask you about how you think about the power of mass protest movements and marches as an effective way to communicate. Like, personally, I think it would scare the shit out of a lot of Washington politicians. And the type of march I'm thinking about is the moratorium march against the Vietnam War in 1973. And that was the march that probably ended the Vietnam War. It was different in its complexion. It wasn't a hippie march, wasn't a student march. It was middle America marching under the American flag, right? It was the mainstream of the country. It was the silent majority. And that march had an enormous impact. Have you thought about, in the context, I know there's been protests, there's been marchings, there's been gatherings, but marches organized of hundreds of thousands of Americans on the Mall, in the Capitol, sit down movements, social protest movements that go beyond the legislative space, because I agree with you completely, right? It is a profoundly moral issue. And as a moral issue, the tactics of that movement have to be imbued with the moral urgency of that movement as well.
I do. Look, I think change takes a whole host of things. It isn't just one policy. It isn't just one protest. It is a whole host of actions. And we certainly saw March for Our Lives, not just the march in DC, but the marches all across the country that actually were hosted by Moms Demand Action volunteers. We saw more marches and more rallies after Buffalo and Uvalde. We had rallies all over, especially outside the Capitol, when we were working on the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. I think those things are important. What I think we don't place enough value on, I always get asked when I do speaking events, like, what can I do? And I say, well, are you a volunteer? Do you show up in your state legislature and in your city council and in your school board? And the answer is often no.
Yeah.
It isn't about posting on social media. It isn't about just showing up at a protest. It is also the unglamorous heavy lifting of grassroots activism. That is what democracy requires. That means you're going to have to show up at gun bill hearings. It means you're going to need to know your lawmakers' names and meet with them and call them. It means that you are going to have to knock doors to get out the vote for gun sense candidates. It means you're going to stand at your farmer's market and hand out materials about secure gun storage. I think that people get frustrated and bored by incremental activities, but I have seen incrementalism lead to revolutions, right? A seismic shift in American politics on this issue. So I think it's a combination of all of those things, but what's happened is that we have this very vocal minority, the gun extremists, who have had a seat at the table. We have to get the silent majority to use their voices and their votes on this issue. I am now a single issue voter. If my family and my community aren't safe, nothing else really matters. That's how we need to be thinking.